Good morning. Just how did we get here? It's a question that a lot of people are asking themselves, and it comes up in many different contexts. Sometimes it's about a relationship. How did we get to a particular place in a relationship? Sometimes it's about material circumstances. How did I get to this place in my life where I'm working for this place, I'm living in that place, so on and so forth. How did we get to this point in whatever it is that we're looking at, whatever we're analyzing, whatever we're examining and really trying to understand better? And so one answer that I want to provide, which again, like everything I talk about, this isn't mine per se. This isn't really new or anything of that sort. About the only thing that's distinct is the way that I'm putting it together and perhaps this little graphic on the screen. Other than that, all this stuff is things that people can find elsewhere. But that said, I wanted to talk through these three basic components on this little graphic. The first bit I want to talk about, how did we get to where we are? The first part is that we are given a set of circumstances that we didn't pick. We are always given a set of circumstances, and well, I guess to modify it slightly, we rarely get to pick. There are certain circumstances where our past choices do influence future choices, but when we're born, for example, like I didn't pick my parents or the state or the year or all that kind of stuff. There were circumstances that I was handed, and by default, I grew up under the presumption that whatever I was handed was normal, was natural, was just part of the mix. And there's actually a biological basis for this, which I found really interesting in an article that I was reading about vaccines and how they could potentially impact our DNA. Because there's already a known impact with respect to the existing virus. I'm actually going to put, close the tab. I'm going to put a link in the description to a PubMed paper that talks about reverse transcribed SARS-CoV-2 RNA can integrate into the genome of cultured human cells and can be expressed in patient-derived tissues. And the key sentence, keep forgetting to drink water. In the abstract, they say that they found in some patient-derived tissues evidence suggesting that a large fraction of the viral sequences is transcribed from integrated DNA copies of viral sequences, generating viral host chimeric transcripts. So it's a hybrid. So there's the person's original genetic code, and then there are bits of RNA that have been re-encoded into the DNA. The integration and transcription of viral sequences may thus contribute to the detection of viral RNA by PCR in patients after infection and clinical recovery. So what they're basically saying there is that these bits of the RNA that have been re-encoded into the DNA of the person are causing the tests that are used for this particular strain to come back as positive, because there is sufficient genetic material to say, oh, hey, this thing is here, even though what they then finish out is they say, because we have detected only subgenomic sequences derived mainly from the something or other end of the viral genome integrated into the DNA of the host cell, infectious virus cannot be produced from the integrated subgenomic SARS-CoV-2 sequences. So basically, they're saying that, look, the genetic material is there, and the test would come back as a positive, but there isn't enough of the virus there to actually produce more of the virus. Like the infection isn't real. And so what this means is that we've now got folks who have been handed a genetic state that is now normal for them. It's normal for that little bit of the RNA to now be a part of their DNA. And again, most people didn't choose that. They didn't want that. They didn't need it. And now we've got complications that are coming because that is true about them now. And this is also part of why I talk about a distinction between objective and subjective truth, because if somebody objectively has sections of a viral RNA that's been re-encoded into their DNA, that's true whether that person likes it or not. That kind of thing. Um, your favorite ice cream is a subjective truth. It's not less true just because it's subjective, but it is a subjective truth. Anyway, so uh, there was a phenomenon where there was a paper I was reading. It was an opinion piece. It was like a blog kind of thing. And it was a doctor. He was in biology, and so he kind of knew more of what he's talking about than I would. But he talked about how, if that's possible, that you now have sequences of that particular virus that have been encoded into that person's DNA, what about their children that they would have after that point? So if the person's genetics are used in the production of new life, and that code is now there and is now present, then the children would inherit that, or have a potential to inherit that genetic code from their parent. And so over time, we might end up as a society in a circumstance where people are by birth already possessing the genetic code from this virus that is now going around. Nobody would have chosen that. That would have been the circumstance that they were handed. And that's why I use the little baton thing. When we live life, we're handed, we've got a handoff when we're born, basically. Here's a bunch of circumstances. And then as we're raised, we're handed more circumstances, and then we're handed information, and hopefully that information gets translated into understanding. But we don't get to pick a lot of it. It's given to us, either by reality itself, by the nature of the circumstances that we are experiencing, or by the choices of other people. So an example might be the experience of divorce in a family. That's not a natural occurrence by any means. It's the consequence of people making choices. And so if you're a young child and all of a sudden you're handed off, hey, mom and dad are getting a divorce, that's going to have an impact on that person, and what they can do then moving on with life is going to be impacted by what they've been handed. So that's the first part of how we got where we were, is that we are constantly given circumstances that we didn't choose, or that maybe we could only choose a portion of, and we have to do something with it. The second part of it, though, is that to the degree that we have choices to make, many cases it's blind leading the blind. So it's people using their own understanding as the litmus test for validity. So this would be, again, an example where the difference between objective and subjective truth is really important. In previous videos, I think I mentioned it. Like, I'm a fan of Chevy. I don't like Ford, but that's a subjective thing, And so even if I have objective evidence that, say, the drivetrains are more reliable in a Chevy, the Ford guys could come in and say, yeah, but your paint is terrible. Your car's rust to death, basically. So it doesn't matter if the drivetrain is good. The car disappears around it. So there's a mixture of objective and subjective truths in that sort of a discussion. And it can be very difficult to parse out the difference between, an anecdote or good data or all that kind of stuff. One of the things that we see right now with respect to the pandemic is that there are a lot of news articles that are across the board with their implications. On the one side, we have folks who tragically lose their lives to the virus. We have folks that are in the middle of that, were sick and have gotten better, but have long-term problems. We have other folks who got sick and got better and don't seem to have anything going along with them. And we've now got a group of folks who are vaccinated and have no problems at all. And then we've got groups of people who've been vaccinated, and it's terrifying, the nature of the things that they are reporting as a consequence of having received a vaccine. How do you sort between the objective and subjective truths in all of that kind of stuff? Because here's the thing, an adverse reaction is going to be conditional. It's not going to be a sure thing from one person to the next, because it's not literally poison in this way that, like if you're shooting people up with arsenic or something like that, or injecting them with lead or those kinds of things that are overt toxins. When you have stuff that's indirectly causing problems where you have complicated chemical reactions occurring inside of the body that's then producing a host of unintended consequences, well, I mean, like, it's unintended. Like, that wasn't the point. And especially if the safety studies that would normally have found these unintended consequences haven't even happened yet, we've got blind leading the blind as to, again, whether it's a good or bad idea. The safest thing to do would be to not participate in the process at all, if only because we just don't know. But, again, that's it. Everybody has to make that judgment for themselves, and unfortunately, we don't always have good, reliable data. We don't see the whole picture. We don't exactly understand what's really going on. The foundation for conspiracy theory is as complicated as, can people keep secrets? That's it. If people can keep secrets and not just tell everybody everything that they're doing, then conspiracy theories exist. As to the degree of validity that a particular conspiracy will be true is going to vary considerably, but even just the fundamental premise, like one cannot intellectually dismiss conspiracy theory as being ridiculous or absurd or anything of that sort. The actual claims need to be evaluated. And again, when evaluating claims, what you're trying to do is take out the subjective stuff and try and find the core, the things that are objectively true, regardless of what people believe about it, so that you can then make a good decision on how to live in light of that truth. And so the second part of this is, we got to where we are because we have blind people leading the blind. We have people putting forth subjective truth as if it were objective truth, and using their own life as an example of, well, don't you want to live like me? Not seeming to understand that, even two siblings being raised in the same home don't have the same experience. So how is somebody who is of a different gender or sex, of a different age, of a different race, a different nationality, different belief system, going down the line, when there are considerable differences between one person and the next, how are you going to actually say that, input this or have this hypothesis, here's your experiment, your input is one thing, your output should be the same, every single time. But if the inputs aren't the same because the people have all these different distinctions, then why would we expect the output to be the same? This is like when people provide advice on things that, if you look at the nature of the people they're trying to provide the advice to, they just don't make sense. For example, one of the things that's frustrating for me is folks from Gen X who haven't quite understood yet that the opportunities that they had been told existed and that they often saw evaporate are genuinely gone. And the millennial generation was raised with those opportunities just gone. They weren't even around. They didn't even get to see them disappear. And so they don't even realize that there were those kinds of things that exist. An example might be that, when people cite, well, I worked my way through college from the older generations like the boomers and whatnot. Gen X saw the shift in that changing, where at the beginning of their generation to the end, the viability of being able to just work your way through college and not have debt and all that kind of stuff was slowly evaporating. But because subjectively some folks were able to make it work in their particular combination of circumstances, they then turn around and try and say, well, everybody else can do the same thing that I did, even if literally not anybody else could actually do the exact same things that they did. Never mind, the fact that would basically be asserting that people need to go back in time and change the conditions that they were handed, back to the first thing. Just go back in time, change the conditions you were handed, make different choices, do different things, and then, then you'll be able to follow this plan and you'll be healthy, wealthy, and whatever, So it's blind leading the blind after having been handed circumstances that we didn't pick. And the third part of that is that we didn't start any of this from a place of security or solid ground. And what I mean by that is that you look at these first two dynamics and then realize that that's been going on since the beginning of recorded history. It's not just, everything was fine. We were anchored in the port and we were good to go. It's no, this boat's been adrift for a really, really long time, to the extent of, all of human history. We go back to Genesis with Adam and Eve, and that boat was no longer anchored. That boat was no longer secure in the port, in the harbor. It was cut adrift, and it was separated from where it needed to be in order to be safe, in order to be protected, in order to be where it was ready to be used, and all that kind of stuff. That's immediately what happened after the fall. Is there was a detachment, a separation between man and God, and man began to drift. Now, sometimes it's tough to use these analogies because it's like, well, but there's individual people that were faithful and others were not. But as a whole, humanity was cut adrift, and we've been adrift for the entirety of recorded history. And so not only then were we handed poor circumstances by the time the story gets to us, not only have the blind been leading the blind the whole time, presuming to know things that are true, which are maybe only conditionally true, subjectively true, and not universally or objectively true. But we also, we didn't even start this journey ourselves, and we've been adrift forever. Things have been wrong for an incredibly long time, and they've been fundamentally wrong too. And if you're a mariner and you understand how boats work, even if you're powered, if you've got a boat that it's got sails or it's got an engine or all that kind of stuff, if you're trying to go from point A to point B and you're off course even the slightest amount, depending on that distance between point A and point B, the new location you would end up at can be really, really far away. Let's put it that way. So, over a short period of time, it may not seem like the difference, the disparity between the heading that you're on and the heading that you should be on makes all that big of a difference. But you start spreading that out over thousands of years, or perhaps even longer. You look at where we are at now, it is not difficult to comment on how messed up everything is. Comment on one of my other videos from Dank was talking about how, stuff's just so messed up, and we have so much of our culture based on pagan cultures of old. The Greeks and the Romans, for example. A lot of the terms that we use today, a lot of the concepts that we have about, for example, politics, came from Greece and Rome. And, they weren't Christian. They were not God-honoring by and large. That was not what people would use to define those distinctives. They were very cold and rational, and, rational to the extent flesh can be. That's what defined them. And that was where the Bible talked about how, the Greeks seek wisdom. They're looking for something that makes sense to them. And so if you look at a lot of the deities, they make sense. Like, they're terrifying. I mean, we've got Bullfinch's mythology, which is kind of like a cleaned up version of that. So like that's one that's more appropriate to read to the kids, because you actually start reading some of the original content. And I mean, you couldn't put this stuff on HBO. It's that level of just messed up, what all of these deities were doing. And so then you look at the society that held those deities up and the things that they were participating in, and you can see a clear link. These were deities that they could understand, that they could comprehend, that they could relate to. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all that kind of stuff, the I am that I am, was completely foreign, was just not understood at all. And even today, many people, even within Christianity, don't dig too deep because they quickly run into soil that is unfamiliar, that they don't know what to do with, and it scares them. And so they never mature, they never grow, they're never pursuing sanctification because they're content with a childish faith as opposed to childlike faith. There's a series that William Lane Craig, or a sermon, that William Lane Craig gave a while back called Intellectual Neutral. And that was one of the phrases that he had referenced, where he talked about how, there's this anti-intellectual knee-jerk response to the Enlightenment philosophers who basically said, okay, we'll grant that, because of God, because of Christian thought, you're going to get particular outcomes, but we're going to try and achieve the same outcomes apart from God. It was supposed to be a new thing, but as with most things, it's the old thing recycled. It's like, that's what people have been trying to do since the garden. There are either those who worship and obey God and his commands, or those who are trying to reproduce the blessing that comes from worshiping God and obeying his commands without having to worship God and obey his commands. Pretty much everybody falls into one of those two camps, and nobody's fallen into either camp forever. We all tend to bounce between the two camps as we live our lives and fall into sin and get caught up in things and all that kind of stuff. But all that to say, again, that we've been adrift. We've had the blind leading the blind, and we've grown up thinking that whatever we were handed was normal. To note a video that I've been trying to work on the side for quite some time, is looking at the kinds of celebrations that Christians participate in, and specifically Christmas. So my family in particular, we don't celebrate Christmas, because we noted that there were a significant number of the practices that we could not trace to the scripture, that we couldn't say, oh, okay, well here's a template, here's where people in the Bible were doing this kind of a thing, and so we can say that participating in these activities is appropriate, especially when we have scriptures that talk about how if what you are doing is leading others to sin, then you should probably stop doing it. For the sake of those other people, it is better to refrain than to participate and potentially put other people at risk. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that materialism is a problem right now. That the narcissism that comes from good gift giving is a problem right now. That we worship stuff and we worship the experiences that surround stuff, and we do that with a greater passion than we do worship Jesus Christ on a day-to-day basis. People will put lights up. People will cut down a tree and put it in their house. They will do special things to commemorate the season, but are those things that God had told us to do? And so that's a big video that would really take a lot more time to unpack and discuss. But that would be an example of where for me, when I understood the truth about what these traditions were, so the Christian Christmas tradition was handed off from one generation to the next, and it has been so for probably about 1,700 years, I would say. There's no record of the early church having celebrated the birth of Christ on the 25th of December. That was an invention that came later on. And what we see then is that since then, the blind have been leading the blind, and a lot of the rationale has been in trying to redeem the practices of the pagans instead of replacing the practices and redeeming people. So I'm going to say that again. So there's been a lot of emphasis on redeeming practices instead of replacing practices and redeeming people. So the idea that's usually cited as a denigration of Christmas is that it made it a lot easier for pagans to participate in the celebration at the same time as Christians, and so it would bring about a better unity within Rome. If everybody could be literally doing the same exact things, but if I'm worshiping my God and you're worshiping your God, we can do that side by side because obviously all deities, imaginary and the one that's real, enjoy being worshipped in the same exact manner. So handed a set of circumstances, or in this case, a tradition, we had blind leading the blind, where instead of saying, all right, well, what does God want us to do, and how would God want us to celebrate this, and what were examples in Old Testament, for example, when God did provide an ordinated celebration, what were the things that people were doing? And is that something that we are using as the template for our modern celebrations or not? And so then, again, the point about being adrift. We have a Roman society which is not, again, ultimately founded in Christ. It was not based on the idea of worshiping God. It was based on this idea that there's a separation of church and state, that there can be a secular system that can control and guide people's behavior, which does not require identifying the purpose and role of a god. We have that currently in the United States through more overt means, but we have people who believe that if you just follow the law, regardless of what you believe, if you just follow the law, then everything will be fine. And what we see is that it's not fine. That things are not working out well. That it's not just enough to have a system of laws in place, that you can't get what you get for obeying God and worshiping God. You can't get the results of that through any other means. So all of this just to say that's a take on how we got where we are. We were handed circumstances, traditions, beliefs, understandings, relationship statuses, all that kind of stuff. We were handed stuff, and we had to run with it. We then discover that the direction that we're supposed to run is often being told to us by those who are blind and trying to lead other blind people, that we don't see the bigger picture. We don't really get what all is going on. And then finally, we realized that the start of the race wasn't where it was supposed to be anyway, that, the whole beginning of the marathon, the whole beginning of human history basically says, hey, we screwed up, and then we disconnected ourselves from the one who loved us and cared for us the most. That's how the story starts. So what are the odds that magically that's going to be, recovered, halfway through, or, in our case, thousands of years down the line? It's not going to happen. So that's how we got here. And that's why being able to be honest about our own faults, about discussing what, that we have a difference of opinion on things is really important, because in looking at a particular circumstance or a doctrine or a tradition, not as a means of, trying to gain social status, but to dig down to what's really true. We all benefit from that. We all benefit from discovering something that is universally true. In the same way that, actually knowing the answer to 2 + 2 is universally beneficial. Because anytime you have two things plus, 2 things, you now have 4 things. That's helpful. That's good information. It's real. But if we're convinced that what we were handed in life was good, if we're convinced that everything we were given was just fine, if we don't think that people are really blind but they genuinely know what they're talking about, and if we think that the story has been blown out of proportion, we're not lost, we're not struggling and as bad as people claim, there's not going to be unity. There's not going to be harmony. There's not going to be a pursuit of truth, because at no point along the line is a recognition of truth even happening. It's just about, well, look, this is the life that I have and that I want to live, and nothing needs to change. And frankly, unless you're God, stuff's going to change. Things are going to be different. I have faults and failures, and the more honest I am about them, and the easier it is for people to see that and then make a choice for themselves as to whether they want to remain in fellowship, the better chance I have to make a good change for the better. The opportunity then that people have to say, all right, well, this is the kind of pain that I'm going to be experiencing with Nate. But I can bear that, or I can understand it, or I can pray for him in that. There's going to be an opportunity to find a truth. There's going to be an opportunity for me to get a bit more of the puzzle, to get a bit more of the picture. And in turn, there is a loyalty, there is an honesty, a devotion that is inspired between myself and those that I interact with, where, hey, look, you helped me on this. Well, here's something else that I might be able to help you on. And in turn, we are both better, not because of ourselves, not because of just what we're doing on our own, but because fundamentally we recognize that there is truth. Because we understand that we don't have the whole picture, and that how we got here was a mess. and that to go anywhere worth going from here, we need God.